All right, so before we get into CSS properties and stuff like that, I want to take a break from VS Code and just go into Google and take a look at the dev tools. Now, if you're not using Google, if you're using Firefox or Safari, those also have developer tools, and they can do all the stuff we're going to do in this video. You just might have to look up the shortcut to get to them, or the menu item to get to them. So in Chrome, if you're on Windows, you can hit F12. That should open them. If you're on a Mac, you can do Option Command I, and that will also open them. And it's also in the menu, so if you go up here and you go to more tools, I know you guys can't see it, but off to the right there's a developer tools option, and I can click that, and that will also open them up. So there's a lot of tabs here, and they're very powerful. We can see network connections, we have a JavaScript console, there's all types of stuff we can do here. But what we want to focus on is the Elements tab. And what this does is it shows us all the HTML and CSS for the page. And by the way, if you want to make this bigger or smaller, you can hit Control plus to make it bigger, or Control minus to make it smaller. Also, if you want it to dock on the side, you could go like that, or the other side, or you could even undock it. This will undock it and put it in a separate window. I usually like to have it on the bottom. But anyways, this is the HTML over here. This is the CSS. Now notice when I hover over something like the body, it actually highlights everything that's in the body. If I hover over the div with the ID of welcome, it hovers over that. Okay, if I uncollapse this and I go over the H2, the paragraph, so whatever I hover over, it's going to highlight in the browser. And then if we want to select something, we can go ahead and hit the select tool. See how it turned blue? And then let's say I want to look at the HTML and CSS for this welcome, this H2 right here. I can click that, and notice that it's now highlighted down here, and it also shows me the CSS. So it shows me the H2 CSS and the class of primary heading, because that's a class that's actually on this element. Now, we didn't put any of this H2 stuff in here. The font size, display block, there's some margin here, font weight bold. This is default browser styling. Okay, every browser has default styling. For the most part, it's pretty much the same. And the way that we can tell this is from the browser is right here, user agent style sheet. Okay, by user agent, it basically means the browser that you're using. This styling is coming from our selector's HTML file. Now, usually this will be a CSS file, because like I said, usually we use external CSS files, and you'll see that when we start getting into projects, but it's just going to give us whatever the file name this CSS is located in. All right, now we can actually change stuff here too temporarily. So this welcome text right here, if I wanted to change this to, let's say, hello, and then click somewhere else, you'll see the text actually changes. I can also, I can change this if I want to, I don't know, other class, and now you'll see that it's no longer blue because it doesn't have the primary heading class. The primary heading is where that blue came from. Okay. Now, what's cool is you can do this with any site. Like if we go to google.com and we open up our tools here, and what I want to do is click the select icon, and then this button right here. So this is actually an input. It has the type of submit. Remember we learned about this stuff in the last section, and the value is I'm feeling lucky. So if I double click this, I can change this to whatever. Let's say I'm feeling awesome, and you might want to have some fun with this. And notice that it's changed now in the browser. Now it hasn't changed on Google's servers so other people can see it. It's only locally to our browser. And if we reload the page, it goes back to normal. So if we wanted to change some CSS, let's go up here and let's click on the body. That gives us the CSS of the body. Let's say we wanted to change the background here, which is white. This is hexadecimal for white. Let's change it to red. So now we have a red body. We can change the color here to white. And notice the text up here is not white because this has its own styling. So if I click the select tool and let's click one of these links right here, notice the color is black. So I'm going to select that and change it to white, and now these links are white. Okay, so you can really have some fun here. You could replace the image link if you want. Whoops, I didn't mean to do that. But yeah, see, now it goes back to normal. But you could change a whole bunch of stuff. You can add content, and it's only local to your machine. No one else sees it, obviously. That would the internet would be a crazy place if you could just edit anyone's site. But it is kind of fun to mess with, and you can learn a lot from doing stuff like that. All right, so I just wanted to kind of introduce you to the Chrome tools, the developer tools. And we will be using these more as we go along in the course. So in the next video, we're going to start to look at fonts. I want to look at different font families. I want to talk about web-safe fonts, and we'll also look at colors. All right, so I'll see you in the next video. All right, guys, in this video, we're going to look at fonts, specifically the font family property and font size property. So you might want to use different styles of fonts in different websites and different user interfaces. So we're going to take a look at how to do that. We're going to talk about web-safe fonts and also how to use fonts from other sources like Google Fonts. So let's create a new file here called 03_fonts.html. And we're going to put our boilerplate in here. And let's go down and just change the title to fonts. And let's put our style tags in here for our CSS. And then I'm going to copy from the last file, the selectors, just the two divs that are in the HTML here, just so we can use them as a text display. So I'm going to save this and then open with Live Server. And let's make it a little bigger. I'll hold Control and hit the plus symbol and just make these a little bigger. All right. So in our style right here, let's add a selector for the body. That's usually where you're going to add your font family, because then it affects your whole page, right? So the fonts for your whole page. So we want to use font-family, which takes in a font stack. So basically a list of different fonts, and in VS Code we get this cool drop down of font stacks that we can choose from. But before we get into that, I want to take a look at web-safe fonts. Now, you have the ability to use pretty much any font that you want that you can get your hands on, but if they're not these web-safe fonts, then you're going to want to include the actual font files within your website, just like you would include a CSS file. And you can also link to them remotely, which I'm going to show you how to do with Google Fonts. But these right here, you don't need to do anything extra for, because they're gonna be available in all browsers that users are using to view your website with. And notice that there's multiple fonts. These are actually called font stacks. For instance, this first one, Arial, Helvetica, Sans Serif. What's going to happen is it's going to look for the Arial font to use. If it can't find that, it'll move to use Helvetica. If it can't find that, it'll use any sans serif font. So basically you have sans serif and serif, and this is an example of what these look like. So basically a serif font has these edges, these points on the edge, and a sans serif font is like a flat look. For the most part, you're probably going to want to use a sans serif font because they just look neater. They also look much more modern, and part of the reason for that is because Times New Roman, which is a very serif font, is the default. Okay, so when we don't add a font family, that's what's used. Some of my favorite web-safe fonts are Arial. I also like Verdana. I like Tahoma. So let's jump back into VS Code and Chrome. And by default, like I said, it's using sans serif. You can see the kind of like the point. See the A right here. So I want to change this to Arial. Now in VS Code, if I just type in A, Arial Helvetica Sans Serif is actually an option. Okay, so this is a font stack. Like I said, it's going to look for Arial, then Helvetica Sans Serif. If I save this, notice how it changes into a flatter looking font. Okay, let's try something else. Let's try Verdana. So if I just put a V in there, Verdana is gonna pop up. So we have Verdana, Geneva, Tahoma, Sans Serif. Save it. It's a little different, but it's still a sans serif font. Okay, so if you want to use something different, something that isn't in that list I showed you, then what I would recommend is using Google Fonts. So I'm going to open up a new browser here and just make it bigger. And let's head over to fonts.google.com. So here you can go over to the search. You can search for certain fonts. You can browse them if you want. You can see samples of them. I like Roboto. That's one I use quite a bit. And you'll see it pops up over here. There's Roboto, Roboto Condensed, Roboto Mono, Slab. So let's say we want to use this Roboto font. We can click this plus sign right here, and we get this little pop-up. And if I click on that, it shows us how we can bring this into our HTML. We can do it using a link tag, just like we do with just regular CSS files. We can also import it into our CSS like this. Usually I do import it, but since we're putting our CSS in the HTML file, I'm just going to use the link. Okay, so if we grab that, and then it shows us how we can actually implement it, we can just add the font family and then Roboto sans serif. So let's go back into VS Code, and let's open up our other browser here. And let's go right below actually we'll go right above the title and paste in that link. Okay, so it links to fonts, googleapis.com/CSS, and then as a parameter it has family equals Roboto. So now we should be able to go ahead and put in Roboto just like it said, and then sans serif. And if I save it, there we go. And that looks pretty nice and clean. I really like the Roboto font. So that's how we can use basically non-web safe fonts. Okay, so next thing I want to look at is font size. Okay, so let's say font size. Now the standard is 16 pixels, and that's actually on the HTML tag. Okay, the HTML tag by default has a font size of 16 pixels. That's what you're seeing. That we do have this zoomed in a little bit. That's why it's bigger. Actually, let's put it back to just let's put it back to just 100%. So I'm going to do Control and then the minus. And that's 110, that's 100, so that's the default. So let's change it to 18 pixels. Okay, and for the most part, I usually leave it at 16, but just to show you, I'll change it to 18 and save, and now you can see it's bigger. Also, we can adjust the line height, which is basically the height of each line. So let's say line dash height. And this is usually in M units, which is a relative unit, and I'm going to go over rem and M units later on, so don't worry if you don't really understand this. But a common value I like to use for the line height for the body is 1.6 M. And we'll save, and notice how now there's more space in between each line. Okay, so I think it makes it look a little cleaner. Now, I want to talk a little bit about units, so pixels, M, and so on. Now, looking at this list of CSS units, this one, which is absolute units, and then we also have relative units, it may be a little overwhelming, but don't worry about it because we don't use most of these. In fact, the only thing we're going to use on this page is pixels. Pixels is the common absolute unit that you're going to use. You can use centimeters, you can use millimeters, inches. You can set your font to 1 inch if you want, but that's not something that you're probably going to do. What you're going to use is pixels, and the exact size of 1 pixel is 1/96 of 1 inch. Okay, there's also points. Points may be familiar from something like Microsoft Word, and 1 point is 1/72 of 1 inch. You may run into points, but for the most part, you're going to see pixels. You also have picas, which it's actually equal to 12 points. Okay, you're not going to really see that. Now, there's also something called relative units, which I'm going to get into later. I'm not going to really focus on this right now. But for instance, you have percentage. You can set it to percentage of a parent element. And by the way, this doesn't have to be just font size. This could be for margin, padding, line height, what else? Width, height, all that stuff. Okay, so you also have M and rem units. M is basically it's a multiplier, so whatever the size of your parent element, let's say the parent div to a paragraph is 16 pixels, and you set it to 1M, that's going to be equal to 16 pixels. If you set it to 1.2M, that'll be equal to 16 pixels times 1.2. Rem units act the same way, except instead of the parent element, they use the root HTML element, which by default is 16 pixels. So if you set it to 1 rem, by default it'll be set to 16 pixels. And if this is confusing the crap out of you, don't worry, we're going to get into this stuff later. I'm not even going to bother going over viewport width and viewport height right now. Alright, so let's head back into VS Code. And I'm actually going to put the font family back to Arial, or Arial Helvetica Sans Serif. And I just want to show you a couple more font properties. So I want to look at font weight and font style, which are very simple. They're basically used to make some text bold or make text italic. So I'm going to add a span in here. So let's say span. I'm going to take the ending tag here, Control C, copy it, delete it, and then put that there, and also put a span down here. Oops. Let's do span, and we'll take the ending tag, put that down here. Alright, so let's save that. Let's go up here, and I want to show you how to target these spans. So for this one here, we can say we want to go into the welcome div. Okay, so the div has the ID of welcome, and then we want to go into the paragraph, and then we want to go into that span. So that's how we can target this first span right here. Now technically we don't even need the paragraph, because it's still going to look into this div with the ID of welcome and then onto the span, but I think it's more organized to keep the paragraph in there, okay, just as an extra step. And let's say we want to make the font weight bold, and notice that this VS Code gives us the selections, which we could use numbers to make them more or less bold, but we're just going to choose bold and save, and notice how now the span, the text that's within the span, is bold. Okay, so just like the strong tag, we can set it to bold through CSS. So let's target this span down here by saying we want the about div paragraph span, and we're going to set the font style to italic and save, and now you can see it's very faint, but this text is now italic. So these are the font based properties. In the next video I want to start to get into colors, and you saw that I used, for instance, the color name like red and green. I also use this weird this number sign and then some letters. That's actually called hexadecimal. We also have something called RGB. So I want to look at colors and the different types that we can use in CSS. Alright, so in this video I want to quickly talk about the different color types that are commonly used. Now I'm not going to go over all of them, but I'm going to go over the ones that you'll see for the most part, the most common types. So let's create a file called 04_colors.html. And let's put our boilerplate in here, and we'll go ahead and change the title to colors. Let's add in our style tags, and as far as the body, let's just put a couple headings. Let's do an H2 here, and an H3. And then up in the style, I'm going to grab the H1 as a selector and give it a color property, which is going to be the color of the text. Okay. Now, as far as colors go, anything I'm going to show you, you can use for the color property. You can also use for the background color. You can also use for a border, anything. And the first type is a name, so we can put like red in here. So let's save this and let's run it with VS Live Server. So open that up, and of course we have a red heading. So this is a color name. Now, in addition to the common colors like red, blue, green, we have a bunch of not so common colors, like for instance coral. If I save that, you can see we get coral. And in VS Code, if I just put any letter in, like a G, it's going to show us all the different options for the different color names. If I put an A, you see all these different colors. We have aqua, aquamarine, azure, B, all these, beige, blue, violet, burlywood, some really weird names. But anyways, these are colored names. So the second color type that we can use is an RGB value. So for the H2, let's say RGB. And this takes in three things, three values, red, green, and blue. And each value should be anywhere between 0 and 255. So if I do 0, that means that the value for red is 0. Okay, let's do green 0, and blue 0. And if I save that, it's going to be black because we have no presence of red, green, or blue. Now the highest you can go is 255. So if I say 255 for the first one here, and in VS Code it even gives us a little preview here, which is nice. But if I save that, we get red. Okay. Now if I wanted it slightly darker, I could do like, I don't know, 210. You can see now it's darker. And let's say I wanted to do all blue. I could go to the last one here. 255 is the highest, and it's as blue as it can get, really. Now there's a lot of different color combinations. Obviously, it can be anything between 0 and 255 for all of these. So if I do, like, let's say 100 of green and maybe, I don't know, 20 of red and save, we get this blue color. Let's tone this down a bit. We'll say like 120 and save, and we get this color, which is like a grayish blue, and it gives you a little preview right here. So just remember that all zeros is black, and then if you do all 255s, take a crack at what that's going to give us. If all zeros are black, then all 255s are going to be white, as you can see, and you can't even read it because the background's white, but as you can see, it is there. So that's red, green, blue, or RGB. Now the third type is the most common and the one that we'll be using the most, and that's hexadecimal, or hex, which is a base 16 number, and it pertains to the composition of a certain color in the RGB space. So it's always going to start with a number sign, and it's going to be 6 or 3 characters that are going to be letters and or numbers. For numbers, it's going to be either 0 to 9, or for letters, it'll be A to F. So all zeros is going to be black, and then all Fs is going to be white. Now, just like RGB, we have red, green, blue. In hexadecimal, we have red, the first two, green, the second two, and blue, the last two. So if I wanted red, I could do FF for red for the first two, and then 00 green, 00 blue, and that gives me red. Okay, if I wanted blue, I'd put F for the last two, like that. And if I did FF in just the middle, it'll be green, and then any combination of any of those. So just like RGB, it's going to give us just a color based off of the values of red, green, and blue. Now, obviously, you're not going to remember all these different hex codes. You may have some preferred colors that you use often that you'll remember, but there's plenty of websites and software that you can use to reference different colors, and I'm going to give you an example in a minute. But what you do want to remember is obviously black, which is all zeros. Now, when you have a hex value that's all the same, you can actually cut it down to 3. So 3 zeros is black, and 3 Fs is white. Okay, you want to remember that. And then anything else that's going to be all the same, like let's say 3 Ds or 3 Cs, it's going to be a shade of gray because all the red, green, and blue values are the same. Same thing if we do like F4 3 times. That's going to be some shade of gray. If we do E3, that'll be a shade of gray. As you can see, it's very light. So some common ones that I use are 333, which is almost black. It's a really dark gray. I think it's cleaner than using jet black, so I use it a lot for backgrounds. If I want a light background, a lot of times I use F4, like that. So those are just some of the ones that I keep in mind. As far as colors, like different blues or reds and stuff, I'll use a reference like this website here. This is color-hex.com. So we just have a palette here of different colors. These are just the latest favorite colors. But we can go up here and we can use the color palette. But if I click one of these, like let's say this is blue right here. Let's say we're building an application or a website and we like this blue. If I click on that, it shows us the hexadecimal, the RGB value, and then other color types as well that I didn't talk about, like HSL, HSV. And you can use these in CSS, but I don't, and they're not that common. Also, what's cool about this site is if you go down, you have a palette of different shades. Okay, different shades and tints that have to do with this hexadecimal value, because often you're going to want a color palette or a color scheme in your website or your application with colors that relate to each other. So you might have, buttons that have this color, and maybe your background has this color or something like that. And then down here you can see the percentages of RGB. So this gives you a lot of information on different colors. It gives you examples in CSS. So really, really helpful site. I would definitely bookmark this site. Another good one is HTML colorcodes.com. And this one here, you can see we have a color palette. We can just kind of slide, and it gives us the hex value, the RGB, the HSL. So this is a pretty cool site as well. Down here we have a color chart. We can click, and it shows us in the header the different values. All right, so you'll learn more as we go along, but I just wanted you to understand these three different types of colors that we can use in CSS. And of course, you can use color names. I prefer hex. Like if I have to make something white or black, I'll use the hex value. A lot of people have asked me why. Why don't I just use white or black? But I like to be consistent. I don't like to I don't like to have color names mixed with hex values. It's just it's just my thing. But you can do it any way you want. So just keep that in mind. Everyone's different. Everyone does things differently. All right, guys. So that's it for this one, and I'll see you in the next video.